Hello, I am Benjamin Miss, and this is Introduction to Psychology, the brain, or physiological psychology. To start, let's look at another myth. This is the left-brained, right-brained debate. Are you left-brained or right-brained, or is this an utterly nonsensical question? Once again, we look at science and pseudoscience, and what this means in psychology. Well, for fun, I went online and I found some tests that would tell me if I'm right-brained or left-brained. This first test I took told me that I am mostly left-brained. However, when I looked at the things that it actually measured, it did something like this. You see the test at the bottom here where it says name the color, not the word. So you see the word red that's written in green, blue that's written in red, and green that's written in blue. So you would read those and you would say green, red, blue, instead of looking at the word and reading the word that says red, blue, green. This is a test of inhibition. This has nothing to do with which side of my brain I'm using. Interesting. I took another one, and this one, I don't even know what this means. Both my right and left hemisphere seem to have reached a level of perfect harmony. Rather than trying to dominate each other, they work together, blah, blah, blah. And then if we keep going, and we see that it says, well, you left brain. It's not even well proofread. You know what I mean? It's like these are just nonsense. Where do these tests come from? Are they scientific? There was one where it said right on it, validated, like scientifically validated. So I clicked on that, and scientifically validated was not about validity, which is a concept, which means you're measuring what you say you're measuring. What they did is they posted a measure of reliability, which is, are we measuring one thing, right? So are we focusing on, is this test a measure of a single concept? So yes, it was a measure of a single concept, but it had nothing to do with my brain in terms of what side I'm using. It was more personality, perhaps. And the issue is, it comes from science. Right? It comes from research, and yet gets way off track. So we start with Broca and Wernicke, who were looking at their patients, and they were studying patients who had strokes and had deficits related to those strokes. And they looked at where there was damage. And both of them had language deficits. Both of their patients had language deficits. And they found that the damage was on the left side of the brain. And things kind of went from there. You know, it was later that Sperry and Gazzaniga looked at split brain patients. These are patients who've had their corpus callosum cut right down the middle, not damaging axons, so wiping out neurons that connect the two hemispheres of the brain, but you have one hemisphere basically acting independent of the other. And this is interesting because this goes back to, you know, where James had said that it was likely that each hemisphere was kind of doing its own thing. You could have multiple consciousnesses in a single brain. And when you cut the connection between them, suddenly, well, yes, you do. And what they found was, for instance, here, patients who had the corpus callosum cut would actually have their visual field separated because your right visual field is back on the left side of your brain and your left visual field is on the right side of your brain. And so if they flashed words on a screen and you fixated it right in the middle and you had your corpus callosum cut, you see the middle image, it's on the right side. The right visual field is processed in the left side of your brain, and therefore you would have it processed there. You would have your language centers being able to identify the word. But if it was flashed on the left side of your visual field, your right hemisphere wouldn't get it, right? Well, I'm sorry, your right hemisphere would get it, but it couldn't do language. But your right hemisphere controls the left hand, and the person could draw a face. So we have this really interesting thing happening here, and it led people to believe that because the left hemisphere was doing some of the languagey stuff, that it was associated with the logical stuff, and people started to speculate, and then confirming evidence. If we believe that someone who is artistic is using the left side of their brain, you're testing for art. You're testing for artistic ability, not for which side of the brain you're using, but for ability. And then you're testing same thing for the right side. So how do you test this? Well, you'd have to demonstrate that one side of the brain is structurally dominant and shows more activity. So that's exactly what Nielsen did in 2013. It took a massive database and tested the left brain, right brain idea and looked at, okay, when someone is resting, what is their brain doing? How is their brain connected? And these are some newer methods of neuroscience, looking at the connections and what's happening. And they looked at over 1,000 fMRI scans, connectivity scans. So you're looking at these connections between areas and what's happening. And they looked at a lot of regions, and they found that there were 20 hubs in the brain. And these hubs were kind of areas of dominance in the brain where they had a lot of connections and were doing a lot of things. Something like Broca's area, where we produce speech. Hub, a lot of connections, a lot going on. So did people show hemispheric dominance? Did they show any kind of dominance? Well, no, only in the hubs. The hemispheres had similar activity. And what this says is, yes, the left hemisphere shows language dominance, the right hemisphere shows attention dominance, but for somebody with a functioning corpus callosum, there was no left brain or right brain dominance. These areas were functioning differently. And so there was nothing that was, special to this other than you have these hubs. So that was the real takeaway from Nielsen. It was an interesting study, but it didn't show us any evidence for left or right brain. So what science does is it takes a look at the brain in a carefully controlled study to see where the dominance actually lies. Pseudoscience takes a piece of information and runs with it and sells people games to practice using their different hemispheres, and based on that. There was another fun study from 2008 that showed that if you post a scientific argument, and you put a picture of a brain on the paper somewhere, people are more likely to believe it. Like, that's how powerful these persuasive methods are. You put a brain there, people are like, oh, that makes sense, I believe this. So, fortunately, my discussion of biopsych has brains all over the place, so I trust that you're just going to accept everything I say as fact. But we have to actually look at the evidence. Take a careful look. Marketers know you put a brain on it, you believe it. There was some neuro water or something that people were selling for a while. But most people don't look at the science behind the claims. Remember that Einstein said, hey, y'all, be careful because silly folks are going to make up stuff and say I said it. Well, of course, he didn't say that. I made that up and said he said it. But there's a lot of quotes that are attributed to Einstein that are not well attributed, that are kind of like, so if you want to, lie and tell people, oh, Einstein said, you can't, because people don't know what Einstein said. But we do, and we look for the sources. And if you can't find a good source, then we question it. Now, I mentioned that these cases where they're splitting these brains, they did find that there were differences in lateralization in the brain. But this makes sense, because if everything was duplicated exactly the same on both sides of the brain, that would be wasteful. Why would you do that? So the brain does have various differences, but that doesn't mean that there's anything about the brain in this regard that is, hemispheric dominance to the point of you're so left brain, or, logical, or, oh, you're so creative and right brain. In fact, please stop using that kind of terminology. Just don't. Say it's logical and creative. It's about personality. Nothing more than that. In our next discussion, we'll go into the anatomy of the brain and neurons. Thank you.